So let's start at the top. So those basic skills that we need for reading, and those have to do with knowing your letters and knowing the sounds that they make and being able to put those letters and sounds together in a word to figure out what the word says. And so in my mind, do you think it would be appropriate to start with the letter position dyslexia?
Yes, that's definitely the case. So if your child tends to, read words and misplace the letters. So if you think about the word board, B-O-A-R-D, if the child reads that as B-R-O-A-D, then they've misplaced the positions of the letters. And so my favorite one is the child who read parties as pirates. And it's really hard to think, those are the same letters. And so that's letter position dyslexia. And if you can't tell exactly where a letter is in the word, you're going to have trouble not only recognizing it, but even translating it to speech by phonic rules. And so you can detect this in children by giving them words like board or pirates, which can be made into other words by mispositioning the letters. If you never give a child a word, if you give a child a word like coat, then that can't be made into any other word. And so the child can eventually figure it out. That must be the word coat. From and form that you're showing up there is another good example. So those are the kinds of words you've got to give the children to pick up this letter position dyslexia. It must be a word that can be made into another word by just changing the order of the letters.
Right. So here I have two words, from and form. I think you can see that. So we're talking about the O and the R being switched.
Yes. And if that's the kind of error that the child makes, then that's letter position dyslexia. But even if you didn't call it that, if you find your child's doing this, then you know this is a problem this particular child has got. The part of skilled reading, which involves knowing where letters are in a word, that's not working properly. And so that's where you can direct your intervention. So this is told you very specifically, rather than just giving some broad intervention, focus on an intervention that tries to improve the child's ability to know where in a word each letter is. And there are various. Yes, go ahead.
So Dr. Coltheart, would you say like minimal pairs? So when we look at from and form, there are minimal pairs in the sense that there's just one letter difference in the sequence. So
I think
is that
that's a very good idea. So if you,
okay,
instead of just showing from, you show from and form, and you can say which of those is form. That's a good approach, and you just see whether that's working. Another approach that's been used is to have the child put their finger under each letter and then to name the letter as they go along. And that teaches them to try and attend systematically from left to right. So both of those are approaches that are worth trying. And you try these approaches and you just see, are these errors becoming less common? In other words, is the intervention working?
Yeah, well, and then another thing is that we see this is when we're looking at non-words or pseudo words, which are phonetically regular words that are not in the English language. And so sorry, I forgot to write the word down on my little board here. If we look at T-A-L-B-E, Talby.
Yes.
It might be switched to table.
Yes, absolutely. And it may be, even though no one's actually studied this properly, that you can diagnose this particular problem much more easily by giving these non-words that can be made into real words. And if you compare that with non-words that can't be made into real words, you might find a whole lot of errors with TALBE that you wouldn't have known about if you hadn't used these kinds of pseudo words, nonsense words. So that might be a very good diagnostic tool.
Right. And then I remember you mentioning something about when we have words like fried and fired, if we have them read and then associate it with a picture.
Yes.
Make sure that they're reading the word correctly by selecting the right picture and not the one that it's mistaken for, like sign or thing.
We've done research on that, and pictures are surprisingly unhelpful And the reason is that you're teaching the child a completely abnormal way of reading, namely look at the picture and figure out what it is. And so if they can figure out the word from the picture, that doesn't mean they'll be able to figure out the word when the picture's not there. So I'm much more inclined to do the kind of thing that Pam mentioned, which is these minimal pairs showing both from and form as words, or doing the finger thing that I mentioned, rather than giving some artificial aid that's not really connected to reading. So I'd be disinclined to use the picture method. I'd rather approach the method, use the methods that I mentioned or Pam mentioned.
Oh, yes, I meant this is more of an assessment versus a strategy.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Intervening, right?
Yes, you could. So if you can find a picture representing fried and a picture representing fired, and so you show those two pictures and then you show the printed word fried, if the child misreads it as fired, then they'll present the wrong picture. So that might be another way of diagnosing this particular highly specific difficulty with reading.
Yeah. And then
I might say one more thing about that, which is these are fairly common sense things. So one can imagine people who aren't really trained in the assessment of reading difficulties, as long as they understand the nature of this particular problem, they can apply these various tests and just see whether the child is making these kinds of errors. And you don't have to be trained to do that. You just need to understand what the nature of this particular reading problem is, which is not very hard to understand for teachers and parents.
right.